What you are about to see is the day Palestine was taken from its people, and the world simply watched it happen. On November 29, 1947, inside the walls of the United Nations headquarters in New York, a decision was made that would change the Middle East forever. The question before the world was simple on paper, but devastating in reality. Should the land of Palestine, a place where people had lived for centuries, be divided and handed away? This was not just a vote, it was a turning point, the moment where the fate of millions of Palestinians was decided by people sitting thousands of miles away, many of whom had never even set foot in the land they were carving up. Why Palestine was at the UN in 1947? To understand why Palestine's future was even on the table, we have to look back a few decades. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain was handed control of Palestine under what was called the British Mandate. Instead of leading the land toward independence, Britain made promises to different groups that would later clash. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, promising to support the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the time, Palestinians made up about 90% of the population, but their voices were ignored. As Jewish immigration increased, especially after the Holocaust, tensions exploded. Palestinians demanded independence, but Britain could not control the growing violence between communities. By 1947, exhausted and unable to maintain order, Britain announced it was washing its hands of the problem and handed Palestine's future over to the newly formed United Nations. For Palestinians, this was not the path to independence they had long hoped for. Instead, it became the moment their homeland's fate was placed in the hands of foreign powers. Whose idea was partition? When the United Nations took up the question of Palestine, they created a committee called UN SCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. 11 countries were chosen to study the issue and recommend a solution. On one side, the Zionist movement lobbied hard, pushing for international recognition of a Jewish state. On the other, the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected partition altogether, demanding full independence and arguing that their majority population had the right to self-determination. UNSCOP's final report was deeply controversial. Instead of granting Palestinians independence, it recommended dividing Palestine into two states. One Jewish, which would control about 55% of the land, even though Jewish people made up only about a third of the population at the time. One Arab, which would get 45% of the land despite being the overwhelming majority. Jerusalem, meanwhile, would be placed under international control. For Palestinians, this proposal felt like an injustice written into law. How could the majority population be forced to surrender most of their land to newcomers without their consent? And yet, this was the plan that was placed before the United Nations General Assembly in November 1947. The vote? November 29, 1947. The world's eyes turned to New York City. It was November 29, 1947, when the United Nations General Assembly gathered to decide the fate of Palestine. The session was tense, with heavy lobbying, backroom negotiations, and immense pressure on smaller nations to vote one way or another. The proposal on the table was Resolution 181, known as the Partition Plan. It needed a two-thirds majority to pass. When the roll call began, the atmosphere inside the chamber was electric. Each country's vote carried the weight of history. 33 nations voted in favor of partition. This included the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and most of Latin America. Some of these countries were persuaded, pressured, or outright lobbied by powerful interests to support the resolution. 13 nations voted against, including every Arab and Muslim country, as well as India, Greece, and Cuba. Their message was clear. Partition was unjust and ignored the rights of the Palestinian majority. 10 nations abstained, including Britain, which had controlled Palestine for decades. By abstaining, Britain avoided direct responsibility, but its withdrawal left the region in chaos. When the final tally was announced, the partition plan had passed. Palestine, without the consent of its people, was divided on paper. In the chamber, Zionist delegates celebrated, some even danced in the aisles. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of a catastrophe. This was the moment that shifted history. A decision made thousands of miles away condemned millions of people to displacement, war, and statelessness. Reactions and immediate consequences. The reactions to the vote could not have been more different. For the Jewish community and the Zionist movement, it was seen as a moment of triumph. After decades of struggle, lobbying, and tragedy in Europe, they had secured international recognition for a Jewish state. Celebrations broke out in New York and across Jewish communities worldwide. But for Palestinians, the outcome was devastating. They saw it as the theft of their homeland, endorsed by the world. How could the majority population, who owned most of the land, be forced to accept less than half of it? The plan felt not like compromise, but betrayal. Across Palestine, protests erupted. Arab leaders condemned the decision, warning that it would lead to violence and instability. The vote immediately deepened the divide between communities in Palestine, setting off clashes in the streets, attacks, and counterattacks. In truth, the UN partition did not bring peace. It lit the fuse of a much larger conflict. Palestinians were pushed to the margins of a decision that determined their future, and they were left with no seat at the table. This was not simply a diplomatic vote. It was the beginning of mass displacement, known later as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Families would be uprooted, villages destroyed, and millions forced into exile in the years that followed. Aftermath and legacy. The moment the UN voted to partition Palestine, the fate of the land and its people was sealed, but the consequences would unfold slowly and painfully. Palestinians who had lived on their land for generations were suddenly faced with the reality that their homes, villages, and towns were now contested territories. Immediately following the vote, violence escalated. Armed clashes erupted between Jewish and Arab communities, and the streets of towns and cities became battlegrounds. Families fled, some hoping to escape temporary skirmishes, only to find they could never return. By the time Israel declared independence in May 1948, over 700,000 Palestinians had been displaced, marking the beginning of the Nakba, the catastrophe. Villages were destroyed, lands confiscated, and generations of Palestinians were forced into refugee camps across the region. Countries around the world watched, but the international community largely failed to intervene to protect Palestinians. The promises of justice and fairness in the UN chambers did not translate into protection on the ground. For many, the vote in New York became synonymous with betrayal, a historical wound that continues to shape the region today. This single session in 1947 was more than a vote. It was a turning point. It was the day the world allowed the displacement of an entire people, and the consequences are still felt by Palestinians nearly 8 decades later. What happened on that day should not be forgotten. The story of Palestine is a story of resilience, of people uprooted, yet refusing to be erased from history. If you believe the world should never forget the plight of Palestine, share this video so others can learn the truth about this pivotal moment. And for more rare historical insights and moments that shaped our world, follow Days Gone By, because history matters, and remembering it is the first step toward understanding.